You've probably stumbled across one of these games. These are rage games, also known as foddian games, or streamer bait games. For the most part, they focus on difficult movement, challenge, and anger. And they've had a complete grip on gaming culture for the past few years. So we're going to go through what makes these frustrating games fun, and where it can go horribly, horribly wrong. So, rage games have been around for a while. The idea of an extremely difficult game isn't anything new. The idea comes from arcade games. Here, developers wanted to maximize profits by making you restart each time you died, so you'd spend more of those coins you'd saved up. This idea permeated throughout gaming culture, with early consoles basing their games off what worked. Games like Jet Set Willy from the Commodore 64 sent you right back to the start if you died. This idea held true later when the NES came around, with games like Super Mario Bros. If you lost all of your lives, then the game was over. Fast forward a bit, with the advent of flash games, this rage dynamic changed a little to what was called troll games, in reference to the trollface memes. Here, games like Cat Mario or Trap Adventure 2 took genre tropes and player agency and kinda said, F you. A good game has traditionally been shown to have a golden path of flow. Not too easy to get bored, not too difficult to turn you off completely. Game designers use this golden flow to make sure that you stay interested, engaged, and feel powerful. An example is Vampire Survivors. Here, the game gets more difficult as the time goes on, and you get stronger and stronger, eventually being so strong that you're wiping out every single enemy on and off the screen in 1 second or less. Troll games kind of flip this on its head. Instead of making the player feel stronger and smarter than the game is designed in such a way that makes it smarter than the player. So, how do they do this? Traditionally, a game designer studies where the player might have hiccups in the game, and they may add information to aid the player in order to keep them on the right path. For an open world game, this might be a convenient pathway or lights in the distance. For a roguelike deck builder, it may be to highlight certain words or information that line up with statuses. However, troll games, like Cat Mario specifically, instead looked at where the players would land or jump, and then would add these annoying traps to stop your progress, making you go all the way back to the start. Yikes. To combat this, the player needs to remember a specific set of actions to get past these traps. As they get deeper and deeper into the level, it becomes a sort of memory game, where you need to remember the exact place to jump and land in order to trigger traps, kinda like Indiana Jones. However, troll games weren't the only flash games that infuriated the players. You had needlessly difficult games, such as the world's hardest game. Here, the selling point was in the name, but the reason it's so difficult was entirely based on timing tiny movements that the player must make, in contrast to the blazingly fast obstacles. To win, you must recognize the patterns of each level and master your stubborn movement. A similar game of this era was Quat. Designed by Bennett Foddy, the challenge arises by a very annoying movement set, where running isn't dictated by simply pressing arrow keys as you'd see in other games, but instead you have to use the Q, W, O, and P keys to control your legs. As I'm sure you can see through all of these games, there's a common trope. 1, difficult movement you need to master, and 2, having to restart all your progress. Through these two tropes, the genre starts to take shape, and the maker of Quat modernized this genre once again with Getting Over It, one of the pioneers of foddian games. In Getting Over It, Bennett Foddy plays around with the idea of having a lot to lose. The main objective is to climb to the top of the mountain, whilst being in a cauldron, and only being able to use a pickaxe to get you to the top. The player is inevitably going to fall in their first playthrough, and when they do, the stakes become clear. You can lose all your progress if you're slightly off with your movement. To Bennett Foddy, this is what makes designing games interesting. He said, As a game designer, the most fundamental problem you're up against is that games don't matter. They're fake. They're imaginary playgrounds. So to him, trying to make something seem deeply meaningful entirely based off how the playground is built and the rules you set in that playground is interesting. Bennett Foddy takes this idea and applies it to modern product and game design. He finds it quite boring. Our modern interfaces are so incredibly easy to understand that our grandmas are using iPhones now. So he flips design tropes on their head and plays into frustration as a game design technique. Unorthodox design is this idea of taking conventions of gaming and flipping them on their head. This can be seen all over the gaming landscape. For example, Balatro stripped the elements of roguelike deck builders, randomization, building up synergies, and permadeath, and then combined it with poker. This is a far cry from traditional roguelike games. However, through some creative, unorthodox design, Local Thunk reinvented what a roguelike could be. To help break this down a little, I have Zac Watson, a lecturer at Media Design School, who's been researching hostile and unorthodox game design.
Unorthodox design implies pretty much one thing, right? Is that there's an orthodox design paradigm, right? So the first thing to remember is, like, in my view at least, a lot of these games don't exist without an existing convention, right? You don't get Kaizo Mario, hard Mario games, without Mario. You've got to have simple Super Mario Brothers for the NES before you get to more complicated custom versions of those levels. So when we're talking about unorthodox design, the important thing to remember is it is interesting because it is not orthodox, right? Like, that's where the excitement comes in. The idea of something like Jump King being interesting is simply because the regular platformer is almost too predictable, right?
So by looking at these ultra-hard rage games, we begin to actually uncover what they're trying to poke at. It's basically satire. Here's Bennett Foddy explaining it in this Google design interview.
It's very orthodox for game designers to be concerned with software design in the way that software designers are. And that has led to certain orthodoxies, like frustration is always bad. Any of these things that we would construct as sort of standing in the way of the function of a piece of software is deemed to be bad in game design. And so as a way of kind of railing against that kind of elimination of frustration and confusion, I try to make games that just do that overtly.
So it makes sense why a game designer may want to make a foddian-like game, but now why would anyone actually want to play a game that's intentionally annoying to play?
First of all, I think challenge is definitely an escape. It's a different kind of challenge though, right? Like, challenge in real life is quite often like complicated, right? Like, you go to a bank and you have to open an account and you do it at 9 a.m. and you're tired and you haven't had breakfast. And the challenge there is like a patience thing. You wait in line, you get to the front, you don't know which forms you have to fill out. You don't have it's like a all-encompassing type of challenge, right? So when we're talking about is challenge an escape, it is in those games in the sense that you're given a very simple set of rules, and the challenge is kind of mastering sometimes the input timing, sometimes when to press something, sometimes when to not press something, and then being okay with the failure is the second part.
So when players overcome something difficult by mastering the controls, they feel accomplished. I mean, in real life, climbing a mountain isn't easy, but when you get to the top and look out at the views and what you managed to do, despite everything, you feel like you've achieved something. And I think this is where we lead to opposing pathways a game's design can take. Frustration is inherently an emotion, but like all emotions, it can be entirely different depending on the context. A prime example of when this went horribly wrong was with Super Smash Brawl. Nintendo added a 1% chance that the player could trip whenever they dashed, and a 1.25% chance that they'll trip when performing a turnaround. This may seem like a small amount, but this infuriated the hardcore players, who train their skills every day to get better.
If only went just a tiny bit deeper before swinging the shuttle loop. Oh no! Oh, wow! Wow, and you hate to see that kind of thing happen, but that is exactly what cost Dark Flame the game last set was a trip. Wow.
J-Tail's mashing out or
And
attempting
he
to.
seals it. Wow, that was really
Super
unfortunate.
unfortunate trip.
For casuals, it can kinda make sense why Nintendo would do this. It can break stalemates by giving a slight advantage to the opposition. Kind of like how in Mario Kart, the person in last place gets better loot from the crates. However, the key distinction is that the chance for brawl was random, whether you were in front or behind, making people who were already losing just hate the game even more. This is an example of when frustration in video games just doesn't work, as it was inconsistent and the player could not control it. However, if the rules that govern the player's movements remain consistent, the player will want to make it to the top of the mountain. Sure, they'll be frustrated, but it's a type of frustration that they know they can overcome and get better at, rather than a random chance. However, now we run into a little bit of a problem with unorthodox design. What happens when your unorthodox design is so fun that it becomes the new meta? It becomes orthodox. Nowadays, we're seeing a lot more foddian type games come out. You have heavily inspired foddian games like a difficult game about climbing, or newer games like Get to Work. Both of these do use rage as a game design pillar, like Getting Over It, but it's hardly fair to say it's unorthodox design when it's inspired, and I think this is where game design is most interesting. It's a constantly evolving medium. Sure, you could go completely unorthodox like Getting Over It, or you could just have a fresh approach to an already existing orthodoxy. So as a game designer, it's really important that you keep in mind all of these genre tropes, how you can mess around with them, and where not to screw up like Super Smash Bros. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, maybe consider liking and subscribing. I'm a fairly new channel, so it would mean a lot. And also I'd like to give a big thanks to Zac Watson, who helped me with the interview. He wanted me to shout out Blueprints because he doesn't have anything else to shout out, so go play Blueprints. See you next time.